That's a discussion that's going to rage on probably until Jesus comes back and sets us all straight, you know? And it's a messy subject, make no doubt. But for as messy a subject as it is, you guys know what my shtick is, what I'm always saying around here. And that is that the Bible is the greatest commentary on itself. And that holds true here, that you can't move on to the next passage without keeping in mind exactly what we've already talked about and discussed. So, the question after last week now becomes, since God has chosen the elect for his purposes, namely to demonstrate his mercy and compassion to all humanity, how does that influence us going forward? And I think it helps if we take a step back even further than what we talked about last week to the beginning of chapter 9. Because we talked about, if we remember what Paul's opening dialogue to chapter 9 was, he was talking about how he was so distraught over the state of the nation of Israel, how they in mass had rejected Jesus Christ as Savior, as the Messiah. And he said, I would gladly be condemned if I could see my brothers come to know Christ as he had. And now, here we come to the end of the chapter, Paul loops back around to this idea in an effort to give us a new sort of realization about this entire idea. So with that in mind, can I get someone to read Romans chapter 9, verses 30 through 33? That might have been the longest I've had to wait for an orange light. Holy cow. Kessa, go ahead, ma'am.
9:30 through chapter 10.
Nope, 9 verse 30 through the end of chapter 9.
Okay, so that's just 2 verses.
Or, yeah, 9:30 through 33, yeah.
What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame.
Thank you. Okay. So, Paul continues a trend that he's been following for a while now. Namely that when he comes to a new topic, he starts it with a question. Most notably, what shall we say then? I feel like we've been asked that several times in the last few chapters. And typically, after Paul asks his question, what's the response? Anybody remember the Greek phrase? Me ginomai, yeah. By no means, God forbid. That's typically been his answer to these rhetorical questions that he's been asking. But a little different this week. You don't see that. Instead, you get a very different kind of idea. So the question is, so what? Are we saying that the Gentiles, who did not have God, found him, while the Jews, who were blessed with his presence, did not? And boy, howdy, isn't that just a ginormous elephant in the room? I mean, when you consider that, that's just such a huge slap in the face to the Jews. To consider that these heathen Gentiles had access to God in a way that many of the Jews had not. To those that were known as God's chosen people, how insulting that must have felt. To think that the Gentiles, these people that Israel had warred against for many years in the Old Testament, now had greater access to God than the Jews did. And so, Paul's question is that what we're saying? Are we saying that the Gentiles have never had God, now they have him, but the Jews who always had access to God have rejected him? Is that what we're saying? And the answer to Paul's question is, well, yeah, actually. That's pretty much exactly what happened. And Paul explains why in a point that's been made over and over and over for years in these very Bible studies. Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. Jeez, talk about letting loose. And for what it's worth, let's just stop right there and let's talk about the reasons that, because when you think about it, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Acts 17:11, and it says, "Now the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians because they studied the scriptures daily to see if those things that Paul was saying were true." And this is kind of the idea that the Gentiles more readily accepted the words of Jesus than the Jews did. Why do we think that is? There's no necessarily right or wrong answer here, guys. I just want to hear what you guys think. Okay. God likes to do the unexpected. He works in mischievous ways. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts? The question was, why do we think the Gentiles were so ready to accept the gospel, whereas most of the Jews were not? That's a really good answer, Bob. I like that one. The Jews had this kind of picture in their mind of what the Messiah would be, and Jesus was not that. All good thoughts. Anything else, guys? Okay, good answers. What I have written down is that I think it had a great deal to do with history. The Jews had been blessed with God's presence and the divine laws for millennia, and they had gotten used to being God's chosen people. And they had never once considered that God would give the Gentiles more than a second glance. But the Gentiles saw that they didn't have any merit of their own. They didn't have any history with God. They'd never had any pursuit of him at any point. All of the revelation had been given to the Jews. As a result, they didn't have anything to fall back on. They had they hadn't, been following the law. They didn't have any of the prophets that had spoken to them. They had nothing. The only way in which they could have accepted God's righteousness was how? If you have no merit to fall back on, then what's the only way you can accept it? By faith. Exactly. And that, of course, was the intent all along. The Jews had become disillusioned by their position. They'd all starry-eyed because they were God's chosen people. The Gentiles, I think, recognized their inadequacy. And that's why they came to the Savior in the only acceptable way. That makes sense to everyone? Now, again, there's no right or wrong answer. That's just what I think. And in verses 32 and 33, Paul gives us this nice little metaphor. He says that the Jews have stumbled over the stumbling stone. Now, that seems pretty simplistic in English, but you guys know me. So we're going to go ahead and board the It's All Greek to Me train and find out what's really at work in this passage. Yeah, woo woo! It is a great tour. Ongerth knows about this All Greek to Me tour. So let's start off with the first really kind of notable word which is the word stone. I am laying in Zion. Zion, by the way, for those that don't know, is typically Jerusalem. It's emblematic of the people of Israel. I'm laying in Zion a stone. So the idea of this stone is actually a two-parter word. It's like a conjunction, or not a conjunction. Is it a conjunction? What's the word that has what's the word that like has two words in it? Can't think of the term. Compound, a compound word. Thank you. Yes. It's a compound word. So you can't disconnect this the word stone from the idea of the stumbling stone. So the phrase here is lithos proskoma, which sounds pretty cool when I say it out loud. And it literally means a stone that causes one to stumble. Ta-da! That's pretty straightforward. Now, the second word is where things really start to get interesting. And even in the English, it kind of gives you a hint that it's not the same thing as the lithos proskoma, because they use a different word. The first word is stone. The second word, they call it a rock. And in Greek, it's also a completely different word. It's the Greek word petra. Anybody know anything about this word? Any significance to this word? I would give you points if you spelled it right. Ah, Mr. Tough Stuff. It's close to Peter's name. Okay. Anything else, guys? Mr. Tough Stuff. Upon this rock I will build my church. It's also the name of some city or place. Okay, great. Play civil a little bit more, kid. It's one of my favorite wonders. Anyways, sidetrack. Petra is the same word that Jesus uses in Matthew 16:18 when he says, upon this rock I will build my church. It's also the same word that he uses when he's giving the parable of the wise and the foolish men who build those houses. When he says the wise man builds his house upon the rock, he says he's building it on his Petra. And this rock isn't some little pebble. It's not something like you'd see in a driveway, a bunch of Petras making up your gravel. No. A Petra it's a rock. This thing is big. It's like protruding out of the ground. It's like a boulder, and its foundation is set in the ground. It's not like even sitting on the dirt. It's like it's coming out really big out of the ground, but you understand there's even more beneath it. It's almost like this idea of a cliff, like a cliff that sticks out from the rest of the mountain. That's kind of the idea of a Petra. Now, just for grins and giggles, Mr. Tough Stuff mentioned that it's close to Peter's name, and he's right. But when Jesus says, and I would name you Peter in Matthew 16, the word he uses there isn't Petra, because Petra is the feminine form of the word. Jesus uses the masculine form in reference to Peter, and it's the word Petros. And Petros isn't this huge rock, but Petros is more like a stone that you can throw. So that's just, that one's free. So when Jesus calls Peter, gives him the name Peter, it's not like you're a huge, powerful rock. He's like, no, you're like a little rock here, man. Good for you. Yeah, free Greek lesson. Now, we've talked about both the role of this rock, it's a stumbling stone, and the size of this rock, it's a big stone. But so far, we've only talked about 2 words, but there's a third that I kind of intentionally passed over because it really kind of directs the conversation. And it's the word laying. Behold, I am laying in Zion. In the Greek, the word is tithemi or tithemi. I'm not sure how it's actually pronounced. And this word really kind of reveals the truth about this passage. And it starts to show us where we're actually going. Because when I come home, when I go to my computer, the way my computer's set up, I don't like wearing stuff on my wrists, and I normally have a couple bracelets on my right wrist and my watch on my left. I don't like having those there when I'm typing on my computer, just the way it's set up. I don't like it. So I will take those off and I will lay them off to the side. Just kind of, I'll toss them. They're sitting over here beside me. That's not the idea of tithemi. It means the idea of laying here is more of an establishing. It's more like a bricklayer. Each brick has its place, and you don't haphazardly set it in a place. It has a purpose. It is specifically meant to be there to fill a role. In other words, this was an act of intent that put this rock, this Petra, there. This humongous boulder is here for a purpose. Keep that in mind. So, Paul's has given us this metaphor, and you know what? I'm going to give you all a story from my past. This really happened. So sit back. This is Scribe's second story time on the day. Many of you guys know that my church has a camp about 45 minutes from where I live out in the country, Virginia. And it's where we had the nativity, but it's been there for years and years and years and years and years. And about 18 years ago, I actually worked out at the church camp. And during one part of the summer, we had a city missions week. And so we would have a bunch of people come in, and during the day, we would actually go into the local city and we would witness to people. And then at night, we would come back to the camp and have like devotions and a sermon. And then sometimes at night, we would play like a night game because we're at a camp and you can't have camp without night games. And so this week we were playing one. It was called a Bible Smuggle. I don't know if you guys have ever played this. But essentially, everybody gets into groups of teams of 4 or 5, and they get handed a, quote, Bible. It's actually just like a folded piece of, it's like a greeting card. It's like a folded piece of colored construction paper. That's your, quote, Bible. And the objective is for your team to get to this other area across the camp without getting caught by the counselors, which are patrolling all across the camp, trying to find these people. And so it's kind of this playful simulation of guys that are smuggling Bibles into closed countries. Okay? So I'm on my team. And since all the counselors are out, you don't want to take the main roads, which are set up all over the camp, because obviously those are open. You'll be easily spotted, and the counselors will come and nail you. And so the point we're trying to get to is the archery range on the other side of the camp. And so my group starts off on a path that I have never been on. I don't know that I've been on since. It just goes off into the woods. I was like, I didn't even know this was here. So we're just going through the woods, being all stealthy like. We're like, ninjas. We're doing fine, but we're just kind of going along. And it's kind of like the twilight, so you can't really see. And you can see us, but we were pretty well hidden. So we're just going along. We're starting to get close when all of a sudden we hear a 4-wheeler beside us on the road because somebody had spotted us.
Oh, no.
And so we're on this path that we're all pretty unfamiliar with. We had spotted it, and it was kind of going the direction towards the archery range, so we just bolt down this path. And we're just running, absolutely cooking tail. And the rest of my team's ahead of me because I was slow. But we're booking. We're staying ahead of this 4-wheeler because he was a bit behind us. And as we're running, we're just trying to stay on the path. And I look up at one point and I realize that I only see one member of my team in front of me. Probably about 10 yards in front of me, 10, 20 yards. And then all of a sudden, he's not there. And I'm like, that's bizarre. What I hadn't noticed was that as I was running along the path had suddenly become less dirt and more rocky. And as we were all running in full stride, breakneck speed, we didn't notice that the path actually ended and came to a cliff, a sheer drop off. And so as we're running, no one's able to stop in time, so they just go whee right over the edge of this drop off. And thankfully, at the underneath the cliff, it was only like maybe 20 feet high. But there had been a pile of like dirt and like those little rubber things that you would tear to like make rubber gravel, so it's not like landing on rock gravel. And that had been piled up probably 10 feet, so it wasn't a long drop. But they fell into it. Everybody actually got into the archery range safely. It was close, but we made it. But it was just stunning. There's this cliff, and all of a sudden we went over, and you better believe there was some stumbling that happened. Now, I say all that to try and explain in a very insufficient, probably, manner, to try and explain what's going on with Paul. Paul isn't saying that this stone was some little pebble that they went and twisted their ankle on. Love you, buddy. No, this is a full-on massive boulder that he just straight up slammed into. It got in their way, it disrupted their lives, and it stood as an obstacle in the path that they were trying to follow. And because of that, they hated that rock. They cursed that rock, and they went so far as to try and completely remove that rock. Which leads us to the next word, the word offense. You see it in the second or the end of the first half of verse 33, a rock of offense. And the Greek word here is scandalon. Oh, Kessa, she's ahead of me. And got her concordance out and everything. Yeah, Kessa didn't even give me an opportunity to bring it up. You can see the word right in there. Scandal. It's right there. And the word literally literally refers to something like a snare or a stick that you would use as bait. It's like a trap, or a reason for someone to fall or stumble. Think of like a tripwire. You know, when you pull on the tripwire, when you apply pressure to it, it sets off a trap, right? It's the same idea here. So the question becomes, what was this trap? So here's a question for y'all. Where did Paul pull this quote from here in verse 33? Feel free to use the footnotes. It's okay. Isaiah. Yep. You know where in Isaiah? Yes, Isaiah 28:16. You guys don't have to turn there. I'll read it for you. Therefore, says the Lord God, behold, I am the one who has laid a foundation in Zion, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of sure foundation. Whoever believes will not be in haste. Now, that sounds pretty similar, but you guys probably noticed there was a distinct lack of a certain idea from what Paul said and what Isaiah writes. Because Paul says he's laying a stone of stumbling. But Isaiah writes that God has laid a foundation in Zion. So what gives? Ooh. Ooh. Oh man, Ongarth, you have trained these guys well. All right. So there's another passage that kind of ties into this. The idea of this foundation. You flip over to Isaiah, not Isaiah. You don't have to turn there again. But Psalm 118:22. This is a very famous verse that is often quoted, but now you know where it's found. And it says, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." So let's go back to the question. What was the trap? The trap that the Jews fell for was that they failed to recognize the cornerstone when they came to it. Instead, they saw it only as a stone of offense, and as a result, they rejected it. And what was this stone of offense? What was this stumbling stone? Jesus Christ. Exactly. He posed a challenge to the ritualistic and traditional teachings of the Pharisees, and he shook up the religious elite of the day. He taught that righteousness was not earned by our works, but through faith in God, and the chief priests and the teachers despised him for it. But at the very end of verse 33, Paul says this. He says, "Whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." And that's kind of an interesting idea when you consider that back in Romans 1:16, Paul says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." And so you see it from both sides. Paul's not ashamed of the gospel, and because of Christ's actions, I'll never be shamed because of the gospel. Kind of cool how that comes full circle, isn't it? And this is where things start to get really incredible. So, could I get someone to read chapter 10, the first 4 verses, please? Night, Corey. Wash, sir. Thank you.
Well, I actually was going to read because coughing, no one would be able to hear me anyway. I had a question on that.
Yeah.
The word shame, what is the Greek on that?
I actually don't know. I will look that up at the end of the service, or Kessa might already be on top of that.
Because it makes me think of some kind of persecution, but will be persecuted in front of men, but you will not be put to shame in front of God.
I would say it isn't much more. It just from what I understand of Romans, I would say it's in a much more eternal perspective, because we know that the world hates us and is always trying to put us to shame. Put to utter confusion. Taiskuno. I'll have to do a little research on that one. I'm gonna be honest. I did kind of glaze over that in my study, so I apologize on that, Wash. I'll look at that after the study, and then I'll have a better answer for you. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Still need someone to read. If not, I'll just read it. Prodigal. All right.
Now, what verses? Chapter 10.
Chapter 10, first 4 verses.
Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer. Am I in the right version?
So far.
Okay. To God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God, and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes.
Thank you. I'm going to be honest, guys. Romans 10 gives me the chills. And I just read through Romans 10, and it gives me goosebumps. in verses 1 through 3, Paul comes out and says, pretty plainly exactly what we investigated back at the end of chapter 9. He reiterates his love for his fellow Jews and his grief over their rejection of the Messiah. And he says, I wish that they would all come to follow Jesus just like I have. And he even admits that they have a certain zeal for God, but unfortunately, it's a misinformed zeal. You see, their passion was to boost themselves up by following the written law that was given from God to Moses. What they failed to recognize, and what Paul already explained in Romans just a few chapters ago, was that the law couldn't grant righteousness. You guys remember that? It said the law couldn't justify. Only God can do that. So, while the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the ABCs, and the thank you please were all trying to accumulate their righteousness by the law, they missed the truth that true righteousness before God could only come from God himself. Which explains why they hated Jesus so much. He taught things that to the religious leaders were contradictions to the law of Moses. Jesus said that he was the fulfillment of the law. And he said that the religious teachers had become blasphemers and false teachers to the nation of Israel. And so it became that the builders, these chief priests and the teachers of the law, the builders rejected what they saw as a stone of offense, but in truth was the chief cornerstone. And that's the answer to chapter 9, verse 33. Why is it interpreted two ways? Because Jesus is both the cornerstone and a stumbling stone. Doc had it exactly right. He is both. And then at the end of verse, or in verse 4, we see this absolutely incredible statement from Paul that probably blew the minds of every Jew the moment that they read it. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And that is an absolutely staggering statement that rightly shook the foundations of what many Jews probably still clung to in that day. And it's a statement that we'll explore more fully next week. So what? So what? Now, I've already said, guys, I love this passage. This is the epitome of the call of the Christian to live by faith and not by sight. Now, I do think that there's one part of all of this that we often miss when we're reading this section of Scripture, and it goes back to this metaphor of Paul's about the idea of this stumbling stone of Jesus. And I want to break that down a little bit. See, if you're like me or Ongert and you've ever stubbed your toe or twisted your ankle or anything like that, you know that there has to be one thing that needs to be true in order for that to happen. And if you're going to stub your toe or if you're going to twist your ankle, anything like that, you have to be moving. It is very difficult to bash your foot into anything if you're standing still. And in much the same way, this is exactly what the Jews had been doing. They had been following a path, a preset listing of commands and orders. And they were convinced that sticking and adhering to these edicts would grant them the righteousness that they both craved and that they deserved. I mean, after all, they were God's chosen people, right? And because they were set on following this path, they ran into a stone a stumbling stone. A stumbling stone that came in the form of the Messiah. But then consider the other side of the argument. Jesus wasn't just a stumbling stone. He's also the cornerstone. And what is a cornerstone? Yeah, it's a foundation. And what is a foundation useful for? A building. Just as in Matthew 7, what was the point of the foundation? What were both the wise and the foolish man building in Romans or in Matthew 7? A house, a place to live. It's a place to dwell. And when you're at home, you don't go anywhere. You dwell there because it's home. And this is a beautiful picture of the idea of works versus faith. If you're trying to work for your salvation, then you run into an enormous obstacle with Jesus. He presents a massive problem for anyone who is trying to stick to this works-based salvation belief. On a side note, this is also why when the world likes to quote Jesus, they tend to pick and choose his statements to support their own belief system. Because if they took everything he said, then their own belief system would fall apart. But if you believe that salvation comes through faith, not in yourself, but in the actions of the Savior, then you don't have to work to your own salvation. You can rest and dwell in peace within the security of the house that Jesus Christ built. And that's why Jesus is both a stumbling stone and a cornerstone. To one group, he was a problem. To the other group, he was the solution. And this is the key to the life of faith. I know I've said it over and over and over again. I know Ongert will probably say it over and over and over again. We'll probably all say it over and over again. But it's not about you. It's not about me. It's about Jesus and what he has done on our behalf. And that goes for you. It goes for me. And as we'll see next week, it goes for the entire world. Your thoughts, guys? Oh, wow. It's 10 o'clock exactly. Holy cow. Wash. If it's about your question you asked earlier, I'm looking it up right now.
No, it's not. It's just
Okay.
that even though it says, laid a stone of stumbling, God also laid 1,000 stop signs beforehand. And it just makes me think of all the prophets and how they're included in the Jewish Bible, yet they just kind of ignore them. It's kind of interesting to me.
It goes back to, what was it that, I think Bob said it, when we were talking about why the Jews accepted the teachings of Jesus more readily than the Jews did, or the Gentiles accepted more readily than the Jews. The Jews were looking for kind of this military Messiah, wanting to be freed from this power of Rome, and this is a classic, maybe the most visible form of eisegesis in Scripture. The Jews were looking for someone who would break them free from physical bondage, from material bondage, servitude to another nation and to establish a kingdom on this world, when that wasn't the purpose at all. From Isaiah 53, that Jesus' role was to come and suffer and die and to pay the price for the sins of all of us. Ooh, Kessa, drawing connections between the Bible study and the book study? Holy cow. Breaking walls, and man, you seem like you'd be really good at dot to dot. I'm sorry. It was an okay compliment. Oh, I already know. I found that. I saw it. Already took it down. No, I look up the word in the concordance and I click on the Hebrew one as opposed to the Greek one. Yeah, that is not the same word. Ooh, okay. That's an interesting point to be made. All right. So going back to Wash's question about this shame, the word is how in the world do you pronounce this? Kataiskuno, we'll say. Sounds good. And it does carry this idea of being ashamed or putting to utter confusion. But in looking at it, there's this interesting idea to make you blush is the idea of the word. And I think when you put it like that, that's the actual building of the word, means to make you blush. I think that ties it even more powerfully together with Romans 1:16, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And so I'm not going to be ashamed of what I go through on account of it. Like, this is just making it known to others. If I have to go through trials and tribulation on account of the gospel, I will face it boldly because I'm not ashamed of it. And I think the shame comes in that eternal perspective when we come to a point, and as Jesus said, if you renounce me before men, I will renounce you before my Father. And I think that's what we're kind of referencing here. Doc, that question feels very experiential. I'm going to need a little bit more background in order to be able to properly answer that. Because if you're getting mashed potatoes all over your face first thing when you get to school, my first question would be, why are you having mashed potatoes for breakfast? Okay. I'm from the South, and we don't have mashed potatoes for breakfast, man. Any other questions, guys? We've kind of gone off a rail just a little bit. Not in great detail, no. I have discussed this. My father has actually had the chance to talk to Jews, to a Jew. He works in a concierge service. He drives people around. He actually had a Jew, kind of a Jewish scholar, and so he had a fun time of discussing, what the canonical Christian Bible would be in comparison to the Jewish Bible and kind of how they view that. And my dad was able to relay that to me and got that discussion. So, yeah, needless to say, there are some differences in perception between how the Jews view the scriptures and how a Christian views the scriptures. But no, I haven't had any personal experience in witnessing to Jews. No problem.
The fact that there are still Jews tells you it's not easy.
That's a tricky question, Kickster. Oftentimes, what I find, especially at work at Barnes & Noble, yeah. The thing is that they tell you there are two things you shouldn't talk about at work: politics and religion. Now, the place where I work in receiving, it's a little bit more free. You can talk more freely because there are no customers around. And I tend to be pretty easygoing. So if you want to express your opinion, that's fine. And most people are okay if I express mine to them. My thing is that if you go in with the proper attitude, people will give ear to you if you say something, and it's best not to try to force it down someone's throat. Because when people get the sensation that you're trying to just beat them over the head with something, they'll shut you off. I believe that God opens opportunities for you. And when those opportunities come, he nudges you with the Spirit to say, hey, why don't you talk about this? And I've had many opportunities where I've just been able to talk about what I believe. I had several opportunities today where I just had opportunities to speak with my coworkers about what I believed and why I act the way that I do. One of which was in reference to a book that I was contemplating reading for story time, but there was something objectionable in it that I was not comfortable having. And as much as I liked the story, I didn't want to read it because this thing in this book conflicted with what I believe as a Christian, and I couldn't associate myself with that. And just these opportunities, it plants the seed of curiosity in people, and it makes them think, why does this person go that way? Why do they believe that? And I think God can work with that. And so it's the act of obedience in the opportunities that arises. And who knows? Paul even says, he says, look, somebody may plant the seed, others waters, and then someone else gets the harvest. I don't have to be the one to lead this person to the Lord. God calls me to a purpose. This is kind of like what we talked about last week in God choosing certain vessels for certain tasks, and also in being, many members, one body. We're all working towards one purpose, but we all have a different job. Now, people make fun of you for what you believe. That's one thing. I know that there are people at my work that don't agree with what I believe. I honestly, I'm not surprised by that, because if I'm looking at it very honestly, why should I be surprised when the world acts like the world? I gave an example from my church. This year, my entire church is praying for one individual person, that God will give us a person that we are to and disciple this year. And just in what I've seen, I feel like God has given me a number of opportunities. Now, I don't know if there's a specific person that he's trying to aim me at, but I'm keeping my eyes open and just waiting to see if he's going to guide me to a particular person, or if he's got multiples in mind, or what. But right now, we're just praying that God would give us one person that we can talk to and ideally lead to the Lord, and then disciple to bring them alongside of us in our walk with Christ. Yeah, you want to. It was William Carey that had to wait. How long was it before he saw the first convert in India? think it was like well over a decade that he preached as like one of the first missionaries to the Indian subcontinent, and had to wait over a decade before he saw a convert. Oh, Prodigal, you're like Torrance. I didn't even see. I'm sorry. If you're saying something, I can't hear you, man. Your mic muted?
Yeah, it was muted.
Oh, there you go.
I just I want to say something. I'll try not to be too long. I used to be a preacher back when I was younger, and I went to college, and it was pretty difficult to go to college and keep living the way I was supposed to. And one thing I did learn is to just be a light to other people. It's our, like you were saying, it's our job to plant the seed, and then it's God's job to make that seed grow into something that will lead that person to Him. And you can look at a person and tell if they're saved or not most of the time. If they're smiling and they're living good, you can see that God is in their life, and just being that person, just being a godly person, will make people want to see what it is that you have. Well, I mean, not all Christians. I'm not saying all Christians are going to be smiling. I'm just saying that there's an aura around. Like, for instance, my cousin Jan. Oh my God, I just love being around her. She makes me feel so good. She's a really good Christian woman. She's always talking about the Bible. She's the one that got me in this new church. And just being around her is something that I enjoy, because you can just feel it. You can feel it radiating off of her. And I just think it's cool.
Guess so you and I are thinking way too similarly. But it's not so simple as putting a smile on your face. I agree. But it's a lifestyle, because when the Spirit dwells within you, the fruit comes out.
No.
And when that's the case, people notice. Because, the fruit of the Spirit is supernatural. We've talked, how many prayer requests did we have? We had 14 prayer requests from different people in this channel alone. We're all going through something. And some of these are much more visible than others. I know that the death of family members is extremely visible. Sickness is extremely visible. But when you display the joy and peace beyond your circumstances, people notice. They take note. They see that there is a joy that surpasses the pain. And people wonder, where does this come from? How can you be suffering like this and yet still be able to experience joy? Because the world doesn't have that. The world has this life, and that's it. And if this life is miserable, then there's no reason for joy. The only explanation for a Christian is that we experience joy because this is just the very tip of life. This is the very smallest portion, and then we have a far greater one that we're expecting and living for now. St. Augustine very famously, or at least it's attributed to him, the very famous quote, "Preach the word, and if necessary, use words." Thank you, Doctor. Coming through in the clutch with the Lewis quote. Sean, your light's orange.
Yeah, I'm just kind of concerned for my brother's marriage right now. My brother's getting married in July. I'm kind of concerned because the girl he's marrying isn't Christian and she's Catholic, and